What would you do if your own family called you a problem that needed solving? If they gathered around your kitchen table like vultures circling prey, whispering about your future as if you weren't sitting right there? I'm Elena Martinez, and at 68, I discovered that being labeled a problem was actually the key to my freedom. The solution they never saw coming was simple. If I was the problem, then I would remove myself from their equation entirely, taking my assets with me. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning it all began, I was standing in my kitchen in Phoenix, Arizona, making fresh tortillas the way my grandmother taught me 60 years ago. The rhythm of rolling and pressing had always calmed my nerves, but today my hands shook slightly as I worked the masa. Through the window, I could see my son Carlos pulling into the driveway in his gleaming black SUV, followed by my daughter-in-law Patricia in her silver Mercedes. They rarely visited together unless something was brewing. I had been a widow for 5 years now, ever since my beloved husband Roberto passed from cancer. Those 5 years had been a journey of rediscovering who Elena Martinez was beyond being someone's wife and mother. I had built a comfortable life in the sprawling ranch-style home Roberto and I purchased in 1982, complete with the desert garden I had lovingly cultivated and the art studio I had finally set up in what used to be Carlos's childhood bedroom. The doorbell rang precisely at 10 o'clock as if they had been sitting in the driveway waiting for the exact appointed time. I wiped my flour-dusted hands on my apron and opened the door to find them both standing there with the kind of serious expressions usually reserved for funeral planning. Carlos, now 43 and carrying the soft belly of a man who spent too much time behind a desk, stepped inside first. His dark hair had started graying at the temples, making him look older than his years, and he wore that particular frown he had perfected as a teenager whenever he disapproved of my choices. Patricia followed, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, clutching a leather portfolio against her chest like armor. "We need to talk, Mom." Carlos's voice carried that tone he used when he thought he was being the responsible adult in the room. It was the same voice he had used when he insisted I sell Roberto's vintage car collection, claiming I couldn't possibly manage the maintenance myself. "Of course, mijo. Would you like some coffee? Fresh tortillas?" I gestured toward the kitchen where the warm scent of masa still lingered in the air, hoping to soften whatever blow was coming my way. "This isn't a social visit, Elena." Patricia's voice was crisp and businesslike. "We need to discuss your living situation." She had long ago stopped calling me Mom, claiming it felt more professional to use my first name. Professional. As if our relationship was some kind of corporate merger. I led them to the living room, where sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the southwestern decor Roberto and I had chosen together. The hand-carved wooden furniture, the vibrant tapestries from our trips to Mexico, the family photos spanning decades of birthdays and holidays. This room held the DNA of our family's history, yet somehow my own son and his wife looked completely out of place in it. Carlos cleared his throat and pulled out a folder from Patricia's portfolio. "Mom, we've been talking, and we think it's time you considered moving into a more manageable living situation, something with built-in support systems." I blinked slowly, processing his words. Built-in support systems. It sounded like corporate speak for something I definitely wouldn't like. What kind of support systems? Patricia leaned forward, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she usually reserved for explaining simple concepts to difficult clients at her real estate firm. "Elena, you're approaching 70. This house is far too large for one person. The cultivated masa. Maintenance alone must be overwhelming. The yard work, the repairs, the general upkeep. It's becoming quite obvious that you're struggling to maintain the standards this property requires." I glanced around my immaculate living room, trying to identify what standards I was apparently failing to meet. The tiles gleamed from my weekly mopping, the plants were lush and healthy, and I had just finished organizing the bookshelf the day before. Struggling was not a word I would have used to describe my relationship with my home. "What Patricia is trying to say," Carlos jumped in, shooting his wife a warning look, "is that we're worried about you being isolated out here. When was the last time you had a real conversation with someone?" When did you last leave this house for something other than grocery shopping? His questions stung because they contained a grain of truth I had been trying to ignore. Since Roberto's death, my social circle had indeed shrunk considerably. Most of our couple friends had drifted away, unsure how to navigate a relationship with just half of the pair they had known. My book club had disbanded when 3 members moved to assisted living facilities. But isolation and inability to care for myself were 2 very different things. I leave the house plenty, I said defensively. I volunteer at the animal shelter twice a week. I take painting classes at the community center. I have my doctor appointments, my hair salon visits, my grocery runs. I'm hardly a hermit. But those aren't real social connections, Patricia pressed. You need to be around people your own age, people who understand what you're going through. That's why we've researched several excellent senior living communities in the area. Senior living communities. The euphemism made my stomach clench. You're talking about retirement homes. They're not retirement homes, Mom. Carlos's voice grew more insistent. They're active adult communities with amenities and activities designed specifically for people in your stage of life. Swimming pools, fitness centers, organized social events, transportation services. You'd have your own apartment, but with the security of knowing help is available if you need it. I studied my son's face, searching for some sign of the little boy who used to crawl into my lap when thunderstorms scared him, who begged me to read just one more bedtime story, who cried when I packed his lunch wrong for school field trips. That boy had grown into a man who apparently viewed his mother as a problem requiring a solution. Have you visited any of these places? I asked quietly. Patricia brightened, mistaking my question for interest rather than the stalling tactic it actually was. We've toured 3 facilities, and they're all quite impressive. Desert Winds has a beautiful arts and crafts center. Sunset Manor offers daily transportation to shopping centers and medical appointments. And Paradise Valley Estates has a golf course and tennis courts. Golf and tennis. I had never played either sport in my life, had no interest in learning them now, and the fact that these were being presented as selling points told me everything I needed to know about how well my family understood my actual interests and needs. What about my house? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Carlos and Patricia exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Well, obviously, you'd need to sell it. The equity would more than cover your expenses at any of these communities, probably for the rest of your life. Patricia could handle the listing and sale. She's got excellent contacts in this market, of course she did. Patricia had been not so subtly hinting about representing me in a potential home sale for the past 2 years, ever since the Phoenix real estate market had exploded and property values in my neighborhood had skyrocketed. My modest ranch home was now worth nearly 3 times what Roberto and I had paid for it, a fact that had not escaped Patricia's attention. And what about my things? My furniture, my art supplies, Roberto's books, the garden I've spent decades cultivating? My voice was getting smaller with each question, as if the walls of
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
my own home were closing in around me. Storage units for anything truly sentimental, Carlos said dismissively. Most of the furniture wouldn't fit in an apartment anyway. You'd be surprised how freeing it can be to downsize, to get rid of all the clutter that's been weighing you down. Clutter. He was calling the accumulation of my entire adult life clutter. The dining room table where we had celebrated every birthday and holiday for 30 years was clutter. The rocking chair where I had nursed him as a baby was clutter. The pottery collection Roberto and I had gathered from every small town we had ever visited was clutter. I need some time to think about this, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Mom, there's really nothing to think about. Carlos's patience was clearly wearing thin. You can't keep living in denial about your limitations. You're not getting any younger, and neither are we. Patricia and I have our own lives to manage. We can't be constantly worried about whether you've fallen in the shower or forgotten to turn off the stove. When have I ever forgotten to turn off the stove? The question came out sharper than I intended, sparked by genuine confusion and growing anger. Well, no, but it's the kind of thing that happens. Patricia's voice was maddeningly reasonable. We're trying to be proactive rather than reactive. It's much better to make these transitions while you're still healthy and mentally sharp, rather than waiting for a crisis to force the decision. Mentally sharp. The phrase hung in the air like a threat, implying that my sharpness was temporary, declining, something that couldn't be counted on for much longer. I wondered when exactly I had been demoted from competent adult to aging liability in their eyes. "I'll give you a few days to process this," Carlos said, standing up and straightening his tie. "But Mom, this isn't really a negotiation. It's what needs to happen." Patricia has appointments scheduled for tours this weekend if you'd like to see the facilities yourself before making a final decision. Final decision. As if the decision hadn't already been made without my input. As if my preference was merely a formality to be acknowledged before proceeding with their predetermined plan. After they left, I sat in my quiet living room for a long time, listening to the grandfather clock Roberto had inherited from his father tick away the minutes. The house felt different somehow, as if my son's words had changed its molecular structure, transformed it from a home into a burden, from a sanctuary into a prison. I walked slowly through each room, seeing it through their eyes for the first time. The master bedroom, with its king-size bed that had been plenty comfortable for Roberto and me but was probably excessive for one person. The guest bedrooms that rarely hosted guests anymore. The formal dining room with its table for 8 that now accommodated only my solitary meals. The 3-car garage where Roberto's workshop still sat largely untouched, his tools hanging exactly where he had left them. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was rattling around in a space too large for my current life, clinging to memories instead of embracing reality. Maybe it was time to simplify, to release my grip on physical possessions and geographical spaces that no longer served their original purpose. But as I stood in my kitchen, running my hands along the countertops, Roberto and I had installed ourselves after saving for 2 years to afford the granite we wanted. I felt something crystallize inside me. This wasn't about what was practical or logical or sensible. This was about who got to decide how Elena Martinez spent the remaining years of her life. The phone rang while I was washing dinner dishes that evening, and Carlos's name appeared on the caller ID. I considered not answering, but old habits and maternal instincts won out. "Mom, I forgot to mention something earlier." His voice was artificially casual, the way it got when he was about to deliver news he knew I wouldn't like. Patricia found out that Mrs. Rodriguez next door is planning to sell her house too. Apparently her kids are making the same recommendation we are. "It might be good for you to talk to her, see how she's feeling about the transition." Mrs. Rodriguez had been my neighbor for 15 years, ever since she and her late husband had moved from California to be closer to their daughter. We waved at each other over the fence, exchanged pleasantries about the weather and the progress of our respective gardens, but we weren't close friends. The idea that her children were also pushing her towards senior living felt too coincidental to be accidental. "Did Patricia suggest that Mrs. Rodriguez list with her too?" I asked, unable to keep the suspicion out of my voice. "Well, yes, but only because she's the most qualified agent in the area for this type of transaction. She specializes in helping seniors navigate real estate transitions." There was a defensive edge in his voice now. How convenient. I regretted the sarcasm the moment it left my mouth, but I couldn't take it back. "Mom, I don't like your tone. We're trying to help you. We're trying to be responsible children who look out for their aging parent. If you want to be stubborn about this, that's your choice. But don't act like we're the bad guys for caring about your welfare. Caring about my welfare." The phrase felt like a slap, implying that my resistance to their plan was evidence of selfishness rather than self-determination. I wondered when caring had become synonymous with controlling, when looking out for someone had transformed into looking past their expressed wishes and preferences. After hanging up, I poured myself a glass of the wine Roberto and I used to share on Friday evenings, a tradition I had maintained despite drinking alone feeling slightly pathetic. I sat on the back patio, watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of orange and pink that would have inspired Roberto to reach for his camera. That's when I remembered the conversation Roberto and I had shared just months before his diagnosis, when his friend Miguel had been moved into assisted living against his wishes. Roberto had been furious, ranting about children who treated their parents like inconvenient burdens rather than human beings with valid preferences and opinions. "Promise me something, Elena," he had said, taking my hand in his. "Promise me that if our son ever tries to ship you off somewhere you don't want to go, you'll fight him. Don't let him steamroll you just because you don't want to cause family conflict. You're stronger than you think, and you deserve better than being managed like a problem that needs solving." At the time, I had laughed off his concern, confident that Carlos would never treat me that way, that our family operated differently than Miguel's. But sitting on my patio with the wine growing warm in my hand, I realized Roberto had seen something I had missed. Some shift in Carlos's attitude that I had been too close to recognize. The next morning brought another surprise visit, this time from my daughter Isabella, who lived in Tucson with her husband and twin daughters. Isabella was 2 years younger than Carlos, with my dark hair and Roberto's easy smile, and she had always been the peacemaker in our family. Her presence usually brought comfort, but today she looked stressed and tired. "Mama, we need to talk." Her voice carried the same ominous tone Carlos had used the day before, and my heart sank. Apparently, this intervention was a coordinated family effort. Isabella hugged me longer than usual, and I caught a whiff of her familiar perfume mixed with something else I couldn't identify. Stress, maybe. Guilt. The scent of difficult conversations and uncomfortable truths. "Carlos called me last night," she said without preamble. "He told me about the conversation you had yesterday. Mama, I had no idea you were struggling so much." "I'm not struggling," I said, pouring coffee for both of us and hoping the familiar ritual might soften whatever was coming next. "I live comfortably. I maintain my home. I take care of myself. I don't understand where this perception is coming from." Isabella accepted the coffee but didn't drink it, instead wrapping her hands around the mug as if seeking warmth. "Mama, when was the last time you visited us in Tucson? When did you last drive anywhere further than the grocery store? The girls ask about their abuela all the time, but you've become so isolated." The guilt hit like a physical blow. It was true that I hadn't visited Tucson in several months, but the drive had become more stressful as traffic increased, and my confidence behind the wheel decreased. It was also true that Isabella rarely initiated visits to Phoenix, claiming that work and the girls' activities kept her too busy for the 2-hour drive. "I could come more often if you invited me," I said quietly, "or if someone offered to drive me occasionally." "That's exactly what I mean, Mama. You shouldn't have to wait for invitations, or depend on others for transportation. These senior communities Carlos researched have shuttle services. You could actually have more social contact than you do now, more activities, more stimulation. More stimulation. As if I were some kind of laboratory animal requiring environmental enrichment to prevent depression and cognitive decline. The phrase made me want to throw my coffee mug against the wall, but instead I gripped it tighter and forced my voice to remain level. "Isabella, do you remember when you were 16 and wanted to study abroad in Spain for a semester? Your father and I thought you were too young, that it was too dangerous, that you weren't ready for that kind of independence." She nodded slowly, confusion flickering across her face at the apparent change of subject. "What did you tell us when we tried to talk you out of it?" Her face flushed as the memory surfaced. "I told you that I was old enough to make my own decisions about my life, and that you needed to trust me to know what was best for me." "And you were right," I said gently. "That semester changed your life. You met Eduardo, you discovered your passion for international business. You gained confidence and independence that served you well for years afterward. Now I'm asking you for the same trust you demanded from us 30 years ago." "Mama, that's different. You were trying to protect a teenager from making impulsive decisions. We're trying to protect our mother from—" She trailed off, apparently realizing that finishing the sentence would require her to articulate exactly what they thought they were protecting me from. "From what, Mija? From living in my own home? From making my own choices? From having control over my own life? From being alone when something goes wrong," she said finally. "From falling down the stairs or having a medical emergency with no one around to help. From becoming one of those elderly people who die alone and aren't discovered for days." Her words hung in the air like a dark prophecy, painting a picture of my future that was both morbid and statistically unlikely. I was healthy, active, and had regular contact with neighbors, medical providers, and service people. The image of me dying alone and undiscovered was emotionally manipulative rather than logically sound. Isabella, I'm 68, not 98. I have regular checkups with Dr. Kim, I wear a medical alert bracelet, and Mrs. Chen across the street checks on me daily when she walks her dog. I'm probably in better health than half the people in those senior communities you're promoting. But Mama, what about 5 years from now? What about 10 years from now? Wouldn't it be better to make this transition while you're still healthy enough to adjust, rather than waiting until it becomes an emergency? There it was again, the assumption that decline was inevitable and rapid, that my current competence was temporary and fragile. The logic was seductive in its apparent reasonableness, but it required me to surrender my present autonomy based on fear of hypothetical future incapacity. Isabella pulled out her phone and showed me several photos of a beautifully landscaped complex with Spanish-style architecture and palm trees. This is Desert Winds, the place Carlos mentioned. Look how lovely it is. Each apartment has a balcony, and they have a library and an art studio. You could continue painting without having to maintain a whole house. The art studio in the photos was generic and sterile, with fluorescent lighting and beige walls that would drain the life out of any creative work. My own studio had north-facing windows that provided perfect natural light, walls I had painted in warm earth tones that inspired me, and enough space to work on large canvases. The difference was like comparing a hospital cafeteria to a grandmother's kitchen. Have you seen the monthly fees for these places? I asked. Patricia showed us the breakdown. It's actually quite reasonable when you factor in all the services included. Meals, housekeeping, activities, transportation, emergency response. When you add up what you currently spend on all those things separately, plus home maintenance and property taxes, it's probably comparable. I had never requested meals, housekeeping, activities, transportation, or emergency response services, so I wasn't sure how their cost was relevant to my situation. It felt like being told that a restaurant was economical because it included an extensive wine list, even if you didn't drink alcohol. Isabella stayed for lunch, and we talked about her daughter's soccer season and her husband's promotion at the engineering firm where he worked. Normal family conversation that felt precious because it didn't involve anyone trying to solve the problem of my life. But as she prepared to leave, she returned to the subject I had hoped we could avoid. Mama, I know this feels overwhelming, but we really do want what's best for you. We're not trying to get rid of you or push you aside. We love you, and we want you to be safe and happy. I know you love me, Mija, but loving someone doesn't give you the right to decide how they should live their life. She hugged me goodbye with tears in her eyes, and I watched her drive away with a sense of finality that had nothing to do with the temporary nature of her visit. Something fundamental had shifted in our relationship, some balance of power that couldn't be easily restored. That evening, I called my friend Rosa, who had been my closest confidant since we met in a pottery class 10 years earlier. Rosa was 72, widowed like me, and had successfully resisted her own family's attempts to convince her to move into assisted living. They're using the fear tactics, Rosa said after I described my week. Classic manipulation. Make you afraid of being alone, afraid of falling, afraid of dying, afraid of becoming a burden. Then present their solution as the only reasonable option. But what if they're right? What if something does happen to me and I'm too far away for them to help? Elena, listen to me. Something could happen to anyone, at any age. I could have a heart attack tomorrow, in the middle of Whole Foods. My nephew could get hit by a drunk driver on his way home from work tonight. We don't make major life decisions based on worst-case scenarios that might never happen. Rosa's practical wisdom grounded me in a way my children's emotional manipulation had not. She was right that fear was a poor foundation for life-altering decisions, but fear was exactly what Carlos and Isabella were selling. Have you talked to a lawyer? Rosa asked. A lawyer? Why would I need a lawyer? To understand your options, to know what rights you have, to make sure no one can force you into anything you don't want to do. The suggestion hadn't occurred to me, but it made sense. If my family was treating this like a business decision, maybe I needed professional advice about the legal and financial implications of their plan. "I'll think about it," I promised. "Don't think too long," Rosa warned. "Once the pressure campaign really starts, it becomes harder to think clearly. They'll wear you down with constant conversations about your safety and their concerns until you agree just to make it stop." After hanging up with Rosa, I sat in Roberto's study, surrounded by his law books from his days as a paralegal and his collection of financial planning guides. Roberto had always been meticulous about our legal and financial affairs, maintaining detailed records and keeping our important documents organized in clearly labeled files. I pulled out the folder marked Estate Planning and reviewed the will Roberto and I had prepared 5 years earlier. Everything was straightforward: the house and its contents to Carlos and Isabella in equal shares, along with our savings and investment accounts. It was a simple document that assumed I would eventually die in this house and leave behind assets for my children to inherit. But what if I didn't die in this house? What if I sold it and moved somewhere else, spending the equity on my own living expenses? What if I decided to use my money for travel, education, or experiences rather than preserving it for inheritance? Had Roberto and I inadvertently trapped me by structuring our estate plan around the assumption that I would live modestly and die quietly, leaving behind the maximum possible inheritance? I found our most recent investment account statements and was startled by the balance. Between Roberto's life insurance payout, our retirement savings, and the appreciation of our carefully chosen stock portfolio, our net worth had grown significantly since his death. The house was worth approximately $400,000, but our liquid assets totaled nearly $600,000. $900,000. Almost $1 million in total assets that Carlos and Isabella apparently viewed as their future inheritance rather than my current resources. No wonder they were so invested in managing my living situation. No wonder Patricia was so eager to handle the real estate transaction. No wonder they wanted me in a facility where my monthly expenses would be predictable and contained. For the first time since Carlos had walked into my kitchen with his serious expression and his folder full of plans, I felt something other than sadness and confusion. I felt angry. Not the sharp, hot anger of a moment's frustration, but the deep, cold anger of someone who has finally recognized the true nature of what's being done to them. My children weren't worried about my welfare. They were worried about their inheritance. They weren't concerned about my safety. They were concerned about their convenience. They didn't want me to be happy. They wanted me to be manageable. The realization was painful, but also clarifying. Once I understood their actual motivations, I could begin to formulate my own response. Once I recognized that this was fundamentally a power struggle disguised as a care conversation, I could start thinking strategically rather than just reacting emotionally. I spent the weekend researching senior living facilities online, not because I was interested in moving into one, but because I wanted to understand exactly what my children were proposing. The websites were slick and professional, filled with photos of smiling elderly people engaged in various activities that looked more like stock photography than authentic documentation of daily life. The monthly fees were staggering. Even the most basic apartments and the most modest facilities cost more than $3,000 per month, with additional charges for meals, activities, transportation, and various levels of care assistance. The luxury facilities Carlos and Patricia had toured charged upward of $5,000 monthly, which would consume $60,000 per year of my assets. At that rate, my $900,000 would last perhaps 12 to 15 years, assuming no major medical expenses or facility fee increases. The math was sobering and revealed another layer of my children's plan. Not only would moving into senior living consume my resources much faster than staying in my own home, it would also eliminate any possibility of leaving them a substantial inheritance. The more I learned about the financial realities of senior living, the more I understood that Carlos and Isabella were proposing a solution that served their immediate convenience, while ultimately reducing their long-term financial benefit. It was such a short-sighted strategy that I began to wonder if they had truly thought through the implications, or if they were simply reacting to some vague discomfort with my independence. On Monday morning, I called the law office of Margaret Santos, an estate planning attorney Rosa had recommended. Margaret was in her 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes, and she listened to my situation without interrupting or offering premature advice. "Elena, your children cannot force you to move anywhere as long as you're mentally competent," Margaret said after I finished explaining my situation. "The decision about where and how to live is yours alone to make. But what if they claim I'm not mentally competent? What if they say I'm becoming forgetful or making poor decisions? Then you would need to be evaluated by a qualified medical professional, not just accused by family members who disagree with your choices. Have you had any cognitive testing done recently? I had a complete physical with Dr. Kim 6 months ago, including memory and cognitive assessments. Everything was normal for my age. Good. I'd recommend getting an updated evaluation and keeping those records readily available. Margaret made a note in her file. Now, let's talk about your assets and how you want to structure things going forward. I showed her the estate planning documents Roberto and I had prepared, and she reviewed them carefully. This is a very standard will, but it doesn't include any provisions for your own potential long-term care needs or wishes about end-of-life care. It also doesn't address what happens if you decide to use your assets for your own purposes, rather than preserving them for inheritance. Is that something I can do? Use my own money for my own purposes? Margaret looked at me with gentle surprise. Elena, it's your money. You can spend it on anything you want. Travel, education, charitable giving, home improvements, luxury items, experiences. There's no legal requirement that you preserve assets for inheritance unless you've specifically committed to doing so in a legal document. But my children are expecting to inherit this money when I die. Expectations aren't legal obligations. Margaret's voice was firm but kind. Many people assume they're entitled to inherit from their parents, but inheritance is a gift, not a right. You have no legal or moral obligation to leave your children any specific amount of money. The conversation was liberating and terrifying in equal measure. For the first time in my adult life, I was being told that I had the right to prioritize my own needs and desires over my children's expectations. It felt simultaneously empowering and selfish, like being given permission to do something I had been taught was fundamentally wrong. Margaret recommended updating my estate planning documents to reflect my current wishes and circumstances, including healthcare directives that would prevent my children from making medical decisions I disagreed with. She also suggested considering a trust structure that would give me more control over how my assets were managed and distributed. The legal consultation lasted 2 hours and cost $400, but it was the best money I had spent in years. Walking out of Margaret's office, I felt like I had been given a roadmap for reclaiming control over my own life. The road might be challenging, but at least now I knew it existed. That evening, Carlos called to check on my progress with the senior living tours. His tone was impatient, as if my failure to immediately embrace his plan was an unnecessary delay rather than a reasonable response to a major life decision. Mom, Patricia has been fielding calls from the facilities about scheduling visits. You need to let us know which places you want to see so we can coordinate the tours. I'm not ready for tours yet, I said calmly. I'm still processing this whole idea. What's to process? You live alone in a house that's too big for you, with no real social connections or support system. These places offer everything you need in a safe, managed environment. It's not complicated. Managed environment. The phrase perfectly captured what they were proposing. Not independence with support, but management with the illusion of choice. A place where my daily routines, social interactions, meals, and activities would be structured and supervised by people who were paid to keep me safe and contained. Carlos, I appreciate your concern, but I've decided I'm not interested in moving to a senior living facility. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight, with barely controlled frustration. Mom, we've spent hours researching these places. Patricia has used her professional connections to get you priority consideration at the best facilities in the area. We're not asking you to make this decision lightly. We're asking you to be reasonable. I am being reasonable. I'm a competent adult making a decision about my own living situation. That's exactly what reasonable people do. You're being stubborn. There's a difference. His accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be effective. I was being stubborn, but stubbornness in defense of personal autonomy didn't strike me as a character flaw. Sometimes stubbornness was just another word for strength. Carlos, I've made my decision. I'm staying in my house. Fine. But don't expect us to keep worrying about you when something goes wrong. Don't expect us to drop everything and rush over here every time you need help with something. We have our own lives to live. The threat was clear. Comply with their plan or lose their support entirely. It was emotional blackmail, wrapped in the language of reasonable boundaries, designed to make me feel guilty for refusing to accommodate their preferences about my life. "I understand," I said quietly. "I'll make sure to arrange for help from other sources when I need it." After hanging up, I sat in my quiet kitchen and felt the weight of what had just happened. My son had essentially told me that his love and support were conditional on my willingness to live according to his preferences. It was a devastating realization that reframed every interaction we had shared over the past several years. But it was also clarifying. Once I understood that Carlos viewed me as a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be supported, I could stop trying to maintain a relationship that apparently no longer existed in any meaningful form. The next morning, I called Margaret Santos and asked to schedule another appointment. This time, I wanted to discuss more than just estate planning. I wanted to explore my options for taking control of my financial future in a way that would make it impossible for my children to manipulate me through emotional or economic pressure. It was time to solve the problem they claimed I had become. But I was going to solve it my way, not theirs. Margaret's office felt like a sanctuary when I returned the following week. Armed with financial statements, medical records, and a growing sense of determination. I had spent the intervening days thinking carefully about what I wanted my life to look like and what I was willing to do to protect my right to live it on my own terms. "Elena, you sounded very different on the phone when you called to schedule this appointment," Margaret observed as I settled into the chair across from her desk. "More resolved, if that makes sense." "It does make sense. I've had time to process what's really happening here, and I've decided I'm not going to let my children bulldoze me into a living situation I don't want." "Good for you. Now, what specifically would you like to explore?" "I want to restructure my finances so that my children cannot pressure me through expectations about inheritance. I want to make it clear that my money is mine to spend as I see fit, and I want legal protections in place to prevent them from challenging my competency if they disagree with my decisions." Margaret smiled, the expression of someone who had helped many clients navigate similar family dynamics. "Those are all achievable goals. Let's talk about your options." Over the next hour, we discussed various trust structures, healthcare directives, and financial strategies that would give me maximum control while providing appropriate protections. Margaret explained how I could establish a revocable living trust that would allow me to manage my assets during my lifetime while specifying how they should be distributed after my death. "The beauty of this structure," Margaret explained, "is that you maintain complete control over the assets while you're alive, but the trust provides clear instructions for distribution that are much harder to challenge than a simple will. What if I want to change the distribution? What if I decide my children's behavior means they shouldn't inherit anything? That's entirely within your rights as the grantor of the trust. You can modify the terms at any time, including changing beneficiaries, adding charitable organizations, or specifying conditions that must be met for inheritance." The idea of conditional inheritance was intriguing. I could require Carlos and Isabella to demonstrate respect for my autonomy before receiving any financial benefit from my death. I could specify that beneficiaries must have maintained a positive relationship with me during my lifetime. I could even donate everything to charity if I chose. Margaret also recommended updating my healthcare directives to include specific provisions about decision-making authority. "We can specify that your children cannot override your expressed wishes about medical treatment or living arrangements, even if they claim to be acting in your best interests." The legal framework was becoming clearer, but I still needed to figure out how to communicate these changes to Carlos and Isabella without creating even more family conflict. Margaret suggested a gradual approach that would give them time to adjust to my new boundaries while making it clear that my decisions were final. "Start by demonstrating your independence in small ways," she advised. "Make decisions about your daily life that show you're thinking clearly and acting deliberately. Document your activities and social connections to counter any claims about isolation or cognitive decline. Then, when you're ready, present the legal changes as a natural evolution of your estate planning rather than a punishment for their behavior." Leaving Margaret's office that day, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Having a concrete plan for protecting my autonomy made the emotional manipulation from my children feel less threatening. They could disapprove of my choices, but they couldn't override them. I decided to start implementing Margaret's advice immediately by reconnecting with activities and people I had been neglecting. My first call was to the Phoenix Art Museum, where I had volunteered before Roberto's illness consumed my attention. Within an hour, I had signed up to resume my docent training and committed to leading tours twice a week. The museum coordinator, Janet, was delighted to have me back. Elena, we've missed your enthusiasm for the contemporary collection. Are you available to start next Wednesday? We have a group of high school students coming for a special program about Southwestern artists. The prospect of sharing my passion for art with young people filled me with energy I hadn't felt in months. Yes, absolutely. I'll be there. My next call was to the community college, where I enrolled in a creative writing class that met Thursday evenings. I had always wanted to explore writing but had never made time for it during the busy years of marriage and child-rearing. Now seemed like the perfect opportunity to try something completely new. Over the next few days, I systematically rebuilt my social calendar. I joined a hiking group for seniors that met Saturday mornings at South Mountain Park. I signed up for a book club at the local library. I even registered for a cooking class focused on regional Mexican cuisine, thinking it would be fun to expand beyond the traditional recipes my grandmother had taught me. Each activity required me to drive to different parts of the city, interact with new people, and demonstrate exactly the kind of engagement and independence my children claimed I was lacking. But more importantly, each activity brought genuine pleasure and a sense of purpose I had been missing. The hiking group was particularly wonderful. The 12 regular members ranged in age from 60 to 78, and they had been exploring Arizona's desert trails together for over 5 years. The group leader, a retired park ranger named Tom, had an encyclopedic knowledge of desert ecology and could identify every plant and bird we encountered. "Elena, you're a natural hiker," Tom said after our second outing, when I had managed the 3-mile Holbert Trail without getting winded. "Have you considered some of the more challenging trails? We're planning a trip to Sedona next month if you're interested." The idea of traveling to Sedona with a group of near strangers would have terrified me a month earlier, but now it sounded like exactly the kind of adventure I wanted to embrace. Count me in. The writing class opened up an entirely different kind of exploration. Our instructor, Professor Martinez, was a published novelist who encouraged us to draw from our own experiences while crafting fiction. For our first assignment, we were asked to write a short story about a moment of unexpected courage. I wrote about a woman who decides to learn to fly airplanes at age 70, despite her family's objections and her own fear of heights. The protagonist discovers that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. When I read the story aloud to the class, several members commented on the authentic emotion and the compelling character development. "Elena, this feels very personal," Professor Martinez observed. "The best fiction often comes from emotional truth, even when the specific events are imaginary." I was discovering that I had more stories to tell than I had ever realized, and more courage to tell them than I had ever tested. Each class session revealed new aspects of my own voice and perspective that had been dormant during the years when my identity was primarily defined by my relationships to other people. The cooking class provided yet another avenue for growth and connection. Chef Rodriguez taught us to prepare dishes I had never attempted, using techniques and ingredients that challenged my assumptions about traditional Mexican cooking. I learned to make mole poblano from scratch, a complex sauce that required grinding multiple types of chilies and balancing dozens of spices. Cooking had always been functional for me, a way to nourish my family efficiently and economically. But Chef Rodriguez taught us to think about food as artistic expression, cultural preservation, and sensory pleasure. Each dish became an opportunity for creativity and experimentation. "You have excellent instincts for seasoning," Chef Rodriguez told me after I successfully prepared chiles en nogada with the delicate walnut cream sauce. "Have you considered taking the advanced class next semester?" 3 weeks into my new routine, I was busier and more socially connected than I had been since Roberto's death. My calendar was filled with activities that brought me joy and challenged me to grow. I was meeting new people, learning new skills, and rediscovering parts of myself that had been buried under years of caregiving and grief. Most importantly, I was generating plenty of evidence that I was mentally sharp, physically capable, and socially engaged. If Carlos and Isabella tried to claim I was isolated or declining, I would have dozens of witnesses who could testify otherwise. Isabella called on a Thursday evening while I was reviewing my notes from writing class. "Mama, Carlos told me you're refusing to visit the senior living facilities. He's really frustrated with your attitude. I'm not frustrated with anything, I said calmly. I'm busy with my new activities and very happy with my current living situation. What new activities? I told her about the museum volunteering, the writing class, the hiking group, and the cooking lessons. Her silence stretched long enough that I began to wonder if she was still listening. Mama, that sounds like a lot for someone your age. Are you sure you're not overcommitting yourself? The question was so absurd I almost laughed. 3 weeks earlier, they had claimed I was too isolated and inactive. Now I was apparently too busy and engaged. It seemed I couldn't win no matter how I chose to live my life. Isabella, I'm doing exactly what you and Carlos said I needed to do. I'm socializing, staying active, engaging with my community. Isn't this what you wanted? Well, yes, but we thought you should do those things in a supervised environment where there are safety protocols and medical staff available if needed. Safety protocols for hiking and museum tours? Medical staff for cooking classes and book clubs? Her concern was becoming increasingly difficult to take seriously. I'm perfectly safe, Mija. All of these activities are designed for people my age, and I'm probably in better physical condition than half the participants. But what if something happens while you're driving to all these places? What if you get confused or lost? I've been driving in Phoenix for 40 years. I think I can manage to find the art museum and the community college. Our conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Isabella raising increasingly far-fetched scenarios about the dangers of my new lifestyle. She seemed genuinely unable to comprehend that increased activity and social engagement were positive developments rather than concerning risks. After hanging up, I realized that my children's opposition to my independence wasn't really about safety or practicality. It was about control and predictability. They wanted me to be manageable, and my growing autonomy threatened their ability to manage me. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Patricia arrived at my door carrying a thick folder and wearing her most professional expression. Elena, I hope you don't mind my stopping by unannounced, but I have some important information to share with you about the real estate market. I invited her in, curious about what new pressure tactic she might be employing. We sat in the living room, where morning sunlight highlighted the desert landscape through my large windows. I've been tracking sales in your neighborhood, and property values are at an all-time high. Patricia spread several printed pages across my coffee table. 3 houses on your street have sold in the past month, all for significantly more than their asking prices. The numbers were impressive. My neighbors were receiving offers that exceeded their expectations, sometimes by substantial amounts. Patricia had clearly done her homework, and her presentation was polished and persuasive. Elena, if you listed your house today, I'm confident we could get at least $450,000, possibly more if we get into a bidding war. That's a huge opportunity that might not last much longer. Why wouldn't it last? I asked. Interest rates are starting to climb, and the supply of available homes is increasing. This seller's market won't continue indefinitely. If you wait too long, you could miss out on maximizing your equity. It was a classic sales technique. Create urgency by implying that delay would result in lost opportunity. The logic was sound from a purely financial perspective, but it ignored the non-monetary value of staying in my own home. Patricia, even if your projections are accurate, where would the extra money come from? You mentioned $450,000, but I thought my house was worth around $400,000. She smiled, clearly pleased that I had asked the right question. That's the beauty of the current market. Your house is worth more than you realized, and the appreciation is accelerating. But Elena, there's another factor to consider. She pulled out a different set of documents. These focused on the costs of home maintenance and property taxes. Your annual expenses for maintaining this house are substantial. Property taxes, insurance, utilities, repairs, landscaping. When you add it all up, you're spending at least $15,000 per year just to live here, not counting food or personal expenses. Again, her numbers were accurate. Homeownership did involve ongoing costs that would be eliminated by moving to a rental situation. But she was comparing the cost of maintaining my preferred lifestyle to the cost of accepting a dramatically different lifestyle, which wasn't really a fair comparison. In a senior living community, Patricia continued, your monthly fee would cover all of those expenses plus meals, activities, transportation, and healthcare coordination. You'd actually save money while gaining services. What about the cost of the senior living community itself? She pulled out brochures for the 3 facilities Carlos had researched, each with detailed pricing information. The monthly fees ranged from $3,200 to $5,800, depending on the size of the apartment and the level of services included. I did some quick mental math. Even the least expensive option would cost $38,000 per year, more than double my current housing expenses. The most expensive option would consume nearly $70,000 annually. Patricia, these facilities cost significantly more than maintaining my house, not less. But you're not factoring in the value of the services included, she said smoothly. Housekeeping, meals, activities, transportation. If you hired people to provide those services in your current home, the cost would be much higher. I don't want housekeeping services. I enjoy maintaining my own home. I don't want prepared meals. I enjoy cooking. I don't want organized activities. I have my own interests and hobbies. Patricia looked genuinely puzzled, as if my preferences were incomprehensible, rather than simply different from her assumptions about what elderly people should want. Elena, I think you're being unrealistic about what you'll want or be able to do as you get older. These services aren't luxuries. They're necessities that you'll eventually need whether you want them or not. Eventually was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Eventually I would need assistance with daily activities, but eventually could be next year or 20 years from now. Making major life decisions based on hypothetical future needs seemed premature at best. Patricia, I appreciate the market analysis, but I'm not interested in selling my house right now. Her professional mask slipped slightly, revealing frustration underneath. Elena, Carlos, and Isabella are really worried about you. They love you and want what's best for you. Fighting them on this isn't helping anyone. Fighting them, as if my refusal to comply with their preferences, was an act of aggression, rather than an exercise of personal autonomy. I'm not fighting anyone. I'm making decisions about my own life based on my own preferences and circumstances. That's what competent adults do. But you're not considering the impact of your decisions on your family. Carlos and Patricia both work full-time and have their own responsibilities. They can't be constantly worried about your safety and well-being. So my choices should be dictated by other people's anxiety levels rather than my own needs and desires. That seemed like a recipe for resentment on all sides. Patricia, I understand that my independence might be inconvenient for Carlos and Isabella, but my life isn't supposed to be convenient for them. It's supposed to be fulfilling for me. She packed up her materials with sharp, efficient movements that suggested our conversation was over. Elena, I hope you'll reconsider. I've seen what happens to elderly people who wait too long to make these transitions. It's much harder when it becomes an emergency rather than a choice. After she left, I sat in my living room feeling emotionally drained, but also oddly proud of myself. I had successfully resisted a sophisticated sales presentation without being rude or defensive. I had clearly articulated my position without wavering or apologizing. Most importantly, I had refused to be manipulated by guilt or fear. That afternoon, I called Margaret Santos to schedule another appointment. The pressure from my family was escalating, and I wanted to move forward with the legal protections we had discussed before they tried some new strategy to undermine my decision-making authority. Margaret, they're not giving up. If anything, they're becoming more persistent and creative about finding ways to convince me that I'm making a mistake. That's not uncommon. Families often increase pressure when their initial approach doesn't work. The good news is that you're documenting your competency beautifully with all these new activities. The bad news is that we need to expedite the legal protections before they try something more drastic. What kind of more drastic things? Adult Protective Services complaints, competency evaluations, emergency guardianship petitions. If they can convince a social worker or judge that you're in immediate danger due to poor judgment, they might be able to override your preferences temporarily. The possibility was terrifying and infuriating in equal measure. The idea that my own children might try to use the legal system to override my autonomy felt like the ultimate betrayal. How do I protect myself from that? We finalize your trust documents, update your healthcare directives, and get you a comprehensive cognitive evaluation from a geriatric specialist. We create a paper trail that demonstrates your mental capacity and clearly articulates your wishes about medical care and living arrangements. Margaret recommended Dr. Sarah Kim, a geriatrician who specialized in cognitive assessments for older adults. Dr. Kim could provide a detailed evaluation that would be much more credible than any claims my family might make about my mental state. I scheduled the appointment for the following week and spent the intervening days mentally preparing for what felt like a test of my right to control my own life. It was absurd that I needed to prove my competency to continue living as I chose, but if that's what it took to protect my autonomy, I was willing to do it. Dr. Kim's office was modern and comfortable, designed to put patients at ease during what could be stressful evaluations. Dr. Kim herself was in her 40s, with a warm manner and an impressive array of credentials displayed on her office wall. Elena, Margaret Santos explained that you're dealing with some family pressure about your living situation, and you'd like to document your cognitive status. Is that accurate? Yes. My children think I should move to assisted living, and I'm concerned they might question my mental capacity if I continue to refuse. That's a reasonable concern. These family dynamics can become quite complicated, especially when there are financial assets involved. Let's start with some basic questions about your daily functioning, then move to more formal, cognitive testing. The evaluation lasted 3 hours and covered everything from memory and attention to problem-solving and decision-making capacity. Dr. Kim asked me to perform various mental tasks, recall lists of words, interpret scenarios, and explain my reasoning for various choices. Elena, your cognitive function is well within normal limits for your age and education level. Dr. Kim reviewed my test results with obvious satisfaction. In fact, your performance was above average in several areas, particularly verbal reasoning and executive function. Executive function was exactly what my family was questioning, so Dr. Kim's assessment felt particularly validating. I'm going to prepare a detailed report documenting your cognitive status and your capacity to make decisions about your living situation, medical care, and financial affairs. This report should provide strong protection against any claims that you lack the mental capacity to make these choices. Dr. Kim also recommended annual cognitive assessments to track any changes over time and provide ongoing documentation of my mental state. It felt excessive, but given my family's behavior, ongoing protection seemed prudent. The next step was finalizing the trust documents with Margaret. We spent several sessions refining the language to ensure my wishes were clearly expressed and legally enforceable. The trust structure we designed was elegant in its simplicity. I would maintain complete control over all assets during my lifetime, with the flexibility to spend money as I chose for any purpose. Upon my death, the remaining assets would be distributed according to terms I could modify at any time. Initially, Carlos and Isabella were designated as equal beneficiaries but with specific conditions attached to their inheritance. They would only receive distributions if they had maintained respectful relationships with me during the final years of my life, as determined by an independent trustee I had selected. Margaret, what if they challenge these conditions as subjective or unfair? The beauty of using an independent trustee is that the decisions won't be made by someone with a financial interest in the outcome. I've worked with this trustee for years, and she's excellent at documenting interactions and making objective assessments of family relationships. I also added provisions for charitable giving that would allow significant portions of my estate to go to organizations I cared about rather than to family members who had treated me poorly. The Arizona Humane Society, the Phoenix Art Museum, and a scholarship fund for first-generation college students would all benefit if my children continued their current approach to our relationship. The final touch was a detailed letter explaining my reasoning for the trust conditions. This document would be sealed until after my death, at which point Carlos and Isabella would learn exactly how their behavior had influenced their inheritance. Margaret, I want them to understand that their financial benefit was directly tied to their treatment of me. I want them to know that respect and love couldn't be taken for granted or manipulated for personal gain. That letter is going to be very powerful. It will give them insight into your thought process and might help them understand the consequences of their choices, even if that understanding comes too late to change the outcome. With the legal framework in place, I felt ready to communicate my boundaries more directly to my family. I decided to start with a family dinner, where I could present my decisions as fait accompli rather than topics for debate. I invited Carlos, Patricia, Isabella, and her husband Eduardo for Sunday dinner, promising to prepare Roberto's famous carne asada recipe. They accepted the invitation eagerly, probably assuming I had finally come to my senses about their senior living recommendations. I spent Saturday preparing for what would likely be a difficult conversation. I made Roberto's marinade exactly as he had taught me, using fresh lime juice, garlic, and a blend of Mexican spices that filled the kitchen with memories of happier family gatherings. I prepared sides of Mexican rice, refried beans, and fresh guacamole, along with homemade tortillas. The meal preparation was meditative and grounding, reminding me of all the family celebrations this kitchen had hosted over the decades. But this dinner would be different. Instead of trying to please everyone and avoid conflict, I would be setting boundaries and accepting whatever consequences resulted. Sunday afternoon arrived with typical Phoenix sunshine and the familiar sounds of my family arriving in my driveway. Carlos and Patricia brought flowers, which struck me as either a peace offering or an attempt to soften me up for whatever pressure they planned to apply. "Mama, something smells incredible in here," Isabella said, hugging me warmly. "I've missed your cooking so much." The dinner conversation started comfortably, focusing on Eduardo's recent promotion, the twins' upcoming soccer tournament, and Patricia's latest real estate successes. For a while, it felt like the family dinners I remembered from before Roberto's death, when our relationships weren't complicated by arguments about my autonomy. But as we finished eating and moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, I knew it was time to address the elephant that had been lurking in the corner all afternoon. "I have some things I need to share with all of you," I began, setting down my coffee cup with deliberate precision. Over the past few weeks, I've given a lot of thought to our discussions about my living situation and my future plans. Carlos straightened in his chair, clearly expecting me to announce my surrender to their wishes. "Mom, we're glad you've been thinking about it seriously. Which facility do you want to visit first?" "I'm not visiting any facilities," I said calmly. "I've decided to stay in my house and continue living independently. But I want to explain some changes I've made to ensure that my wishes are respected." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Patricia and Carlos exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their frustration and disbelief. I've updated my estate planning documents to reflect my current circumstances and priorities. I've also had comprehensive medical and cognitive evaluations to document my capacity to make these decisions. "What kind of changes?" Isabella's voice was careful, as if she was afraid of the answer. "I've established a trust that gives me complete control over my assets during my lifetime, with provisions for distribution after my death that reflect my values and priorities." Carlos's face was growing red, always a sign that his temper was rising. "Mom, you can't just change everything without discussing it with us. We're your family. We have a right to know what you're planning. You have a right to know my general plans, but you don't have a right to approve or veto my decisions. I'm sharing this information with you as a courtesy, not because I need your permission." Eduardo, who had been quietly observing the conversation, finally spoke up. "Elena, I think what Carlos means is that major financial decisions can affect the whole family. Maybe it would be helpful if you explained your reasoning." I appreciated Eduardo's diplomatic approach, and his question gave me an opening to address the real issues underlying our conflict. "Eduardo, you're right that financial decisions can affect families. That's exactly why I've structured things the way I have. For weeks, you've all been pressuring me to make choices based on your convenience rather than my preferences. You've treated my assets as if they were already your inheritance rather than my resources for living the life I choose." Isabella looked stricken. "Mama, we never said anything about inheritance. We're worried about your safety and happiness." "Isabella, your concern about my safety is noted, but I'm not interested in trading my autonomy for your peace of mind." As for inheritance, Patricia has made it very clear that she's been tracking my home's value and planning for its sale. Carlos has made comments about managing my money more responsibly. Those aren't safety concerns, those are financial interests. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of Roberto's grandfather clock. I could see each of them processing my words and perhaps recognizing how their behavior had appeared from my perspective. Patricia was the first to recover her composure. "Elena, I think you're misunderstanding our motives. Yes, I mentioned the real estate market, but only because I thought you should know what your options were. I wasn't trying to pressure you into selling. Patricia, you showed up at my house unannounced, with a folder full of market analysis and sales pressure. You told me this opportunity might not last, and that I needed to act quickly. How is that not pressure? She didn't have a good answer for that question, which was answer enough. Carlos tried a different approach. Mom, even if you're right about our motives, which I'm not saying you are, doesn't it make sense to plan for the future? What happens when you can't live alone anymore? What happens if you need medical care or assistance with daily activities? Carlos, I've planned for those possibilities. I have long-term care insurance. I have healthcare directives that specify my preferences for medical treatment. I have financial resources to hire help if and when I need it. I've planned much more thoroughly than you have. What about family involvement? What about our input on decisions that affect us too? This was the crux of the matter, the fundamental disagreement about who had the right to make decisions about my life. Carlos, my decisions about where to live and how to spend my money don't actually affect you unless you're counting on inheriting specific amounts at specific times. If you're planning your own financial future around my death, that's a mistake you need to correct. Isabella started crying, which had always been her response to family conflict. Mama, you're talking like you don't trust us anymore. Like you think we don't love you. Isabella, I know you love me. But love doesn't give you the right to override my choices when you disagree with them. Love means supporting my right to live according to my own values and preferences, even when those preferences inconvenience you. Eduardo put his arm around Isabella and addressed me directly. Elena, I think everyone's emotions are running high right now. Maybe we should table this conversation and revisit it when we've all had time to process. Eduardo, I appreciate your diplomacy, but this isn't really a conversation. I'm informing you of decisions I've already made. Those decisions aren't open for debate or revision based on your preferences. The dinner ended awkwardly, with stiff hugs and promises to talk soon that felt hollow and obligatory. As I watched them drive away, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because I had probably damaged relationships that couldn't be easily repaired. Relief because I had finally stopped pretending that keeping peace was more important than maintaining my dignity. That evening, I called Rosa to debrief the conversation and get perspective on how it had gone. Elena, you did exactly what you needed to do. You set clear boundaries and communicated your decisions without apologizing or asking for permission. That takes tremendous courage. But Rosa, I may have ruined my relationships with my children permanently. What if they decide they can't accept my choices and cut off contact entirely? Then you'll know where you really stood with them all along. Rosa's voice was gentle but firm. Elena, relationships that require you to surrender your autonomy aren't healthy relationships. They're control dynamics disguised as love. The next few days passed quietly, with no calls or visits from Carlos or Isabella. Their silence felt ominous, as if they were regrouping for a different kind of assault on my independence. I used the time to focus on my new activities, and to appreciate the peace of living without constant pressure to justify my choices. On Thursday evening, I was returning from my writing class when I noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street from my house. The driver appeared to be watching my house, and something about the situation felt wrong. I made a mental note of the license plate and called Margaret Santos the next morning. Margaret, I think my family might be having me watched or investigated. There was someone parked outside my house last night who drove away when I got home. That's concerning but not surprising. Sometimes families hire private investigators or ask friends to monitor elderly relatives they're worried about. It's not illegal, but it suggests they're building some kind of case. What kind of case? Possibly a competency challenge or an adult protective services complaint. If they can document behavior they consider concerning, they might try to initiate legal proceedings to override your decision-making authority. The possibility that my own children might try to have me declared incompetent was both frightening and infuriating. I had done everything possible to demonstrate my mental capacity and document my decision-making process, but the legal system could be unpredictable when families claimed to be acting in an elderly person's best interests. Margaret, what's my best defense against that kind of challenge? Continue documenting your competency and independence. Keep detailed records of your activities, social interactions, and decision-making processes. Make sure your medical team is aware of the family pressure you're facing, so they can provide appropriate documentation if needed. I also started keeping a journal of my daily activities, interactions, and thoughts. If anyone questioned my mental state or decision-making capacity, I would have detailed contemporaneous records to support my competency. The journal quickly became more than just legal protection. Writing about my experiences and emotions helped me process the dramatic changes in my family relationships and clarify my own priorities for the future. I wrote about the joy I found in my art museum volunteering, the sense of accomplishment from completing challenging hikes, and the creative satisfaction of my writing class assignments. I also wrote honestly about the grief I felt over the deterioration of my relationships with Carlos and Isabella. Losing their support and approval was painful, even when I knew their demands were unreasonable. I had spent decades being the kind of mother who prioritized family harmony over personal fulfillment, and changing that pattern required mourning the loss of my former identity. But alongside the grief, I documented growing confidence and satisfaction with my new life. I was discovering interests and capabilities I had never explored, forming friendships based on shared interests rather than family obligations, and experiencing the unique pleasure of making choices based purely on my own preferences. 3 weeks after our difficult family dinner, Isabella called and asked if she could visit alone, without Carlos or Patricia. Her voice sounded different, more tentative, and less certain than usual. "Mama, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, and I realize I may have been unfair to you. Could we talk? Just the two of us?" "Of course, Misha. You're always welcome here." Isabella arrived the next afternoon carrying a small bouquet of desert wildflowers and wearing an expression of nervous uncertainty. We sat in the kitchen where we had shared so many conversations over the years, but this time the dynamic between us felt fundamentally different. "Mama, I owe you an apology." Isabella's voice was quiet and careful. "I've been thinking about what you said about respecting your choices, and I realize I've been treating you like you couldn't take care of yourself instead of trusting your judgment." I was surprised by her directness and apparent sincerity. It was the first acknowledgement from either of my children, but their approach might have been problematic. "Isabella, I appreciate you saying that. It means a lot to me that you're willing to reconsider. I've also been thinking about my own motivations, and I'm not proud of what I discovered." Isabella fidgeted with her coffee cup, clearly uncomfortable with what she was about to admit. "Part of my concern was genuine worry about your safety, but part of it was also about convenience. It felt easier to have you in a managed facility where I wouldn't have to worry about whether you were okay." Her honesty was both painful and refreshing. Most people weren't willing to examine their own motivations that closely, or admit to feelings that reflected poorly on their character. And I think, if I'm being completely honest, there was also a financial component. Eduardo and I have been struggling with the girls' college expenses, and I was counting on eventual inheritance to help with those costs. When you started talking about restructuring your estate, I panicked about how that might affect our financial planning. Isabella's admission took tremendous courage, and I respected her willingness to be vulnerable about motivations she clearly wasn't proud of. "Isabella, I'm grateful for your honesty. It helps me understand why this has been so difficult for everyone." "Mama, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Are you happy with the choices you're making? Are you truly better off living alone and managing everything yourself?" It was a fair question, and one I had been asking myself regularly since this whole conflict began. "Isabella, I'm happier than I've been since your father died. I'm discovering parts of myself I had forgotten about, forming new friendships, learning new skills. I wake up each morning excited about my day, rather than just trying to get through it. But aren't you ever lonely? Don't you miss having family around?" Of course I get lonely sometimes. But loneliness isn't the same as being alone, and having family around isn't the same as having meaningful connections. I'd rather be alone and autonomous than surrounded by people who don't respect my choices. Isabella nodded slowly, as if she was processing a concept that hadn't occurred to her before. "Mama, what would need to change for you to feel comfortable having more family? Involvement in your life?" That was exactly the right question, and I was impressed that she had thought to ask it. "Isabella, I need to know that my choices will be respected even when you disagree with them. I need to know that your concern for my welfare won't be used to justify overriding my preferences. I need to know that our relationship is based on love and respect rather than your anxiety about my independence." She was quiet for a long time, considering my words. Finally, she spoke again. "Mama, I think I can commit to that. It might take me some time to change my habits and reactions, but I want to try." We talked for another hour about specific ways our relationship could evolve, to honor both her concern for my welfare and my need for autonomy. Isabella agreed to ask about my preferences before offering advice, to respect my decisions even when she worried about them, and to focus on being supportive rather than directive. Most importantly, she agreed to have a conversation with Carlos about adjusting his approach as well. Their united front against my independence had been powerful, but perhaps a united front in support of my autonomy could be equally effective. As Isabella prepared to leave, she hugged me with genuine warmth for the first time in months. "Mama, I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. It probably took more courage than I would have had in your situation." Her words meant more to me than any apology could have. For the first time since this conflict began, I felt like one of my children was seeing me as a person rather than a problem. After Isabella left, I sat in my garden watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of orange and purple that never failed to move me. The conversation had gone better than I had dared to hope, but I knew that one supportive child wasn't enough to resolve the larger family dynamics. Carlos remained opposed to my independence, and Patricia's financial interests in my real estate decision hadn't changed. The pressure might decrease, but it probably wouldn't disappear entirely. I needed to be prepared for ongoing conflict while hoping for eventual resolution. That evening, I updated my journal with details of Isabella's visit and my cautious optimism about our relationship moving forward. Writing about the conversation helped me identify the specific changes that had made such a difference in our interaction. Isabella had listened without interrupting, asked questions without arguing, and acknowledged her own problematic motivations without becoming defensive. She had approached our conversation as an opportunity to understand, rather than an opportunity to convince. Those skills could be learned and practiced by other family members if they were willing to make the effort, but more than anything, Isabella had treated me like a competent adult whose preferences mattered, even when those preferences were inconvenient for her. That fundamental shift in perspective had transformed our entire dynamic and given me hope that healthy family relationships were still possible. The following week brought news that tested my optimism about family reconciliation. Carlos called to inform me that he and Patricia had decided to move forward with their own plans, regardless of my cooperation or approval. "Mom, since you're determined to stay in that house, Patricia and I are buying a condo in Scottsdale that's specifically designed for aging in place. When you eventually need help, you can move in with us instead of going to a facility." The announcement was presented as a generous offer, but it felt more like a threat disguised as a gift. Carlos was essentially saying that he had already decided where I would live when I became unable to care for myself, regardless of my own preferences or wishes. The condo purchase was his way of maintaining control over my future, while appearing to offer a family-centered solution. "Mom, this way you won't have to deal with strangers taking care of you. Patricia can coordinate your medical appointments and meals, and I'll handle all the financial and legal stuff you won't want to worry about anymore." The casual assumption that I would eventually want them to handle my financial and legal affairs was particularly galling. Carlos seemed incapable of imagining a scenario where I remained competent to manage my own life until the end. "Carlos, I appreciate the thought, but I haven't asked you to make plans for my future care. I have my own plans, and they don't include moving in with you and Patricia." "Mom, you're being unrealistic. Everyone needs help eventually. We're just trying to be proactive instead of waiting for a crisis. If and when I need help, I'll make my own arrangements. I may hire caregivers to come to my house, or I may choose a facility that meets my specific needs and preferences. But those will be my decisions to make when the time comes." The conversation deteriorated from there, with Carlos becoming increasingly frustrated with my refusal to appreciate his planning efforts. He seemed genuinely unable to understand that his generosity felt like imprisonment to me. After hanging up, I realized that Carlos's condo purchase represented a significant financial commitment to a plan I had never agreed to support. He and Patricia were essentially betting hundreds of thousands of dollars that they would eventually be able to override my autonomy and force me to live according to their preferences. That level of investment in controlling my future felt both flattering and terrifying. Flattering because it suggested they valued having me in their lives enough to make major financial sacrifices. Terrifying because it meant they were unlikely to accept my independence gracefully. I called Margaret Santos to discuss the legal implications of Carlos's plan and ensure that my documented wishes would be respected, even if I became incapacitated. Elena, the healthcare directives we prepared should protect you from being moved against your wishes, but we might want to add some additional specificity about your preferences for care arrangements. We scheduled an appointment to review and strengthen my legal documents, adding detailed provisions about my preferences for home care versus institutional care, my views on life-sustaining medical treatment, and my specific instructions about who should and should not be involved in healthcare decisions. Margaret also recommended naming an independent healthcare proxy in addition to my family members, someone who could advocate for my documented wishes even if my children disagreed with them. Do you have someone in mind who could serve in that role? I thought immediately of Rosa, who had been such a strong advocate for my autonomy throughout this entire process. Rosa was older than my children but younger than me, with adult children of her own who had successfully navigated similar issues. She was also fiercely independent and unlikely to be intimidated by family pressure. Rosa agreed to serve as my healthcare proxy without hesitation. Elena, I'd be honored to help protect your wishes. I've seen too many women our age get steamrolled by well-meaning children who think they know what's best. With the legal protections strengthened, I felt more confident about maintaining my independence even if my health declined. But I also realized that the ongoing family conflict was taking an emotional toll that might eventually compromise my well-being, regardless of my legal rights. I decided to write letters to both Carlos and Isabella, explaining my perspective on our family dynamics and my hopes for our relationships going forward. The letters would give me an opportunity to articulate my feelings without the interruptions and defensiveness that characterized our verbal conversations. Carlos's letter was the more difficult to write, as I needed to address his controlling behavior while acknowledging his genuine concern for my welfare. Carlos, I know you love me and want me to be safe and happy. Those are wonderful qualities in a son, and I'm grateful to have raised someone who cares so deeply about family. But love expressed through control isn't really love at all. It's anxiety dressed up as caring. When you make plans for my future without consulting me, when you dismiss my preferences as unrealistic or unsafe, when you assume I'll eventually need you to make my decisions for me, you're treating me like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. I understand that watching your mother age is frightening. The idea that I might become frail or confused or dependent challenges your sense of security about the world. But your fear doesn't give you the right to make preemptive decisions about my life. I'm asking you to trust me to know my own mind and make my own choices for as long as I'm able to do so. I'm asking you to support my autonomy, even when it makes you uncomfortable. I'm asking you to love me enough to let me live according to my own values rather than yours. If you can do those things, we can have a wonderful relationship built on mutual respect and genuine care. If you can't, then we'll have to accept that our relationship will be limited by your need to control my choices. Isabella's letter was warmer but equally direct about my expectations for our relationship going forward. Isabella, our conversation last week gave me hope that we can rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect. Your willingness to examine your own motivations and acknowledge the ways your behavior had been problematic took tremendous courage and maturity. I want you to know that I don't expect you to stop worrying about me or caring about my welfare. Those feelings are natural and appropriate. What I need is for your concern to be expressed through support rather than pressure, through trust rather than control. When you're worried about a decision I'm making, please tell me about your concerns and then trust me to weigh them along with all the other factors that inform my choices. When you disagree with my preferences, please respect my right to prioritize different values than you would choose. Most importantly, please remember that my independence isn't a rejection of our relationship. My insistence on making my own choices isn't evidence that I don't value your input. My resistance to your suggestions isn't proof that I don't love you. I love you deeply, and I want you to be part of my life for as long as possible. But I need that relationship to honor who I am, rather than requiring me to become someone else for your comfort. I mailed both letters on a Friday afternoon, timing the delivery so my children would receive them over the weekend, when they had time to read and reflect without work pressures. Carlos called on Sunday evening, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Mom, I got your letter. I have to say, I'm pretty hurt by some of the things you wrote. I'm sorry the letter hurt your feelings, but I'm not sorry for writing it. Those are things that needed to be said. You make it sound like I'm some kind of controlling dictator who doesn't care about your feelings. That's not fair, and it's not accurate. Carlos, I didn't say you don't care about my feelings. I said you prioritize your comfort over my autonomy. Those are different things." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Carlos defending his behavior and me trying to explain why his good intentions didn't justify his controlling approach. We didn't reach any resolution, but I felt he had at least heard my perspective clearly. Isabella's response was very different. She called on Monday morning sounding thoughtful rather than defensive. "Mama, thank you for the letter. It helped me understand some things I hadn't fully grasped before. I want to do better, and I think your letter gives me a roadmap for how to approach our relationship differently." That response confirmed my sense that Isabella was genuinely committed to changing her behavior, rather than just managing my reactions to it. Over the next few months, I settled into a routine that balanced family relationships with personal independence. Isabella visited regularly, but she asked about my preferences instead of making assumptions about what I needed. We had honest conversations about her worries, without those concerns becoming pressure for me to change my behavior. Carlos remained more distant, clearly struggling with my refusal to accept his plans for my future. Our conversations were polite, but strained, and he continued to make comments about my stubbornness and unrealistic expectations about aging independently. Patricia stopped visiting entirely, after I made it clear that I wasn't interested in discussing real estate opportunities. Her absence actually improved the family dynamic, as her financial motivations had been a persistent source of tension. My new activities continued to bring joy and fulfillment to my daily life. The hiking group had become a central part of my social world, with several members becoming genuine friends beyond our shared outdoor adventures. Tom, the retired park ranger, had become particularly close, and we often extended our hikes with lunch at scenic spots around the Phoenix area. The writing class had exceeded my expectations, with Professor Martinez encouraging me to submit one of my stories to a literary magazine for seniors. Having my work considered for publication felt like a validation of creative abilities I had never fully explored. Most surprisingly, my volunteer work at the Art Museum had led to an opportunity to co-curate a small exhibition featuring local artists over 60. The project combined my love of art with my passion for challenging stereotypes about aging and creativity. Each of these activities generated evidence that contradicted my family's assumptions about the limitations of aging. I was more socially connected, intellectually stimulated, and creatively fulfilled than I had been in years. My calendar was full of meaningful commitments that brought both pleasure and purpose to my daily life. The cognitive assessments Dr. Kim had recommended showed continued normal functioning with no signs of decline. My physical health remained excellent, with my primary care physician commenting favorably on my energy levels and overall fitness. 6 months after our family dinner confrontation, I felt confident that I had successfully defended my right to live according to my own preferences. The legal protections were in place, my competency was well documented, and I had built a support network that wasn't dependent on family approval. But the real victory wasn't legal or medical. It was personal. I had rediscovered Elena Martinez as an individual, rather than just a mother, widow, or aging relative. I had proven to myself that it was possible to prioritize my own needs without becoming selfish, to set boundaries without becoming hostile, to demand respect without becoming unreasonable. The financial trust I had established was serving its intended purpose of protecting my autonomy while ensuring my resources would be available for my own needs. I had used some of the money to make home improvements that would support aging in place, including bathroom safety modifications and a state-of-the-art security system. I had also begun making charitable donations to organizations that supported older women's independence, including a local nonprofit that provided legal services for elderly people facing family pressure about their living arrangements. The most satisfying expenditure was a trip to Spain that I booked for the following spring. I would be traveling with a group from my writing class to explore the regions that had inspired some of our favorite authors. It was exactly the kind of adventure Roberto and I had always planned to take someday, and I was finally claiming that someday for myself. When Carlos learned about the Spain trip, his reaction was predictably negative. "Mom, traveling overseas at your age is dangerous and irresponsible. What if something happens to you in a foreign country?" "Carlos, people my age travel internationally all the time. The group includes a retired nurse and a former travel agent. We'll have comprehensive travel insurance and 24-hour emergency support. I'll probably be safer than I am driving around Phoenix. But why spend that money on travel when you might need it for healthcare or assisted living?" His question revealed the fundamental difference in our perspectives. Carlos viewed my money as a resource to be preserved for hypothetical future needs. I viewed it as a tool for creating the life I wanted to live right now. "Carlos, I might need that money for healthcare in 10 years, or I might die next month and never need it at all. What I know for certain is that I want to see Spain while I'm healthy enough to enjoy it." That conversation marked a turning point in my relationship with money and financial planning. Instead of hoarding resources for an uncertain future, I began spending deliberately on experiences and opportunities that brought immediate pleasure and fulfillment. I upgraded my art studio with professional lighting and high-quality supplies. I bought a more reliable car with safety features that would support longer road trips. I hired a landscaping service to maintain the more physically demanding aspects of my garden care. Each expenditure represented a choice to invest in my current quality of life rather than sacrificing present happiness for future security. The trust structure ensured that any remaining assets would be distributed according to my values, but I was no longer organizing my life around maximizing inheritance for children who had shown so little respect for my autonomy. 1 year after our original confrontation, Isabella and I had developed a relationship that felt both closer and more honest than it had ever been. She had kept her commitment to respecting my choices, and I had maintained my openness to her input and concern. Carlos remained distant and disapproving, but his inability to accept my independence had become his problem rather than mine. I continued to invite him to family gatherings and include him in important decisions, but I no longer modified my behavior to accommodate his anxiety about my choices. The most profound change was in my own sense of identity and purpose. I had discovered that the problem my family wanted to solve wasn't actually a problem at all. My independence wasn't dangerous or irresponsible. My autonomy wasn't selfish or unrealistic. My insistence on making my own choices wasn't evidence of cognitive decline or poor judgment. The real problem had been my family's inability to accept that I was still a person with valid preferences and the right to live according to my own values. Solving that problem hadn't required changing my behavior or accepting their limitations. It had required removing their power to define what my life should look like. I was no longer the problem that needed solving. I was Elena Martinez, a woman who had successfully defended her right to age with dignity, autonomy, and purpose. I was a person who had learned that removing yourself from other people's problem-solving equation could be the most empowering decision you ever make. The Spain trip was everything I had hoped it would be, and more. Walking through the narrow streets of Seville, touring the Alhambra in Granada, sitting in a cafe in Madrid, writing in my journal about the day's adventures, I felt more alive and engaged than I had since Roberto's death. My traveling companions became dear friends, and we planned additional trips together for the following year. I had found a community of people who shared my belief that aging should be about expansion rather than contraction, about embracing new experiences rather than accepting limitations. When I returned from Spain, I found that my relationship with my home had changed as well. It was no longer a place I was clinging to out of stubbornness or fear of change. It was a launching pad for adventures, a sanctuary for reflection, and a canvas for creative expression. I had solved the problem of being seen as a problem by refusing to be diminished by other people's limitations. I had removed myself from their assets, both literally and figuratively, and discovered that I was far more valuable than they had ever imagined. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.